On this episode, we're looking at George A. Romero's adaptation of Stephen King's The Dark Half, starring Timothy Hutton, Amy Madigan, Michael Rooker, and Timothy Hutton. Oh, and a lot of sparrows, like a lot of sparrows.
What the hell?
When it comes to Stephen King adaptations, it's usually pretty cut and dried which films are beloved and which are condemned. There are plenty of King movies that stand somewhere in the middle for the majority of his fans, and a handful of them don't get nearly the respect they deserve. For my money, The Dark Half can be considered one of the most underappreciated gems. It's both a really good adaptation of the source material and a hell of an entertaining movie directed by one of the best there ever was, George A. Romero. Romero had recently had a rough time making Monkey Shines with Orion Pictures and was looking for a new gig. He was attempting to launch a remake of Night of the Living Dead, which eventually did get off the ground with Tom Savini directing when he read a copy of King's bestseller. Romero loved it and decided it would be his next picture. Despite the problems he had with Orion, Romero felt like he could go to them with The Dark Half, partially because there was a new regime there and he thought the people might be, as he put it, kinder and gentler. Such lofty hopes would not come to pass, but the studio did agree to produce the film. Indeed, Romero found himself battling this new regime as well as his star Timothy Hutton. A little more on that later. Hutton stars as Thad Beaumont, a respected author and teacher who enjoys a side living writing lurid crime novels under the pen name George Stark. It's trash, but enjoyable trash, and Beaumont gets so into the Stark persona when he writes said trash that he scares his wife. But when his secret is exposed by a sleazy blackmailer, Beaumont decides to get the jump on him, admit he's been Stark all along, and bury his alter ego for good. Only problem is, Stark doesn't want to be dead, and the once imaginary character comes to life and begins a quest to destroy Beaumont's life by going after those who helped kill off the Stark name and framing Thad for the crimes. It all leads to a surprisingly apocalyptic showdown where only one can be the victor. Gary Oldman and Willem Dafoe were considered for the lead, but neither could do it, and Romero went to Timothy Hutton for the role of Thad Beaumont as well as his alter ego and evil twin George Stark. Hutton turned out to be a method actor on set and caused Romero and the rest of the production many a headache. For example, Hutton demanded to be called George when in the Stark costume and generally had a bad temperament on set, something that did not please the easygoing Romero. The film encountered further trouble when it was completed as Orion went bankrupt, delaying the film's release by about 2 years. It didn't make much of an impact when it finally came out, as critics and moviegoers alike reacted with general indifference to the horror flick, but time has been good to the film. Perhaps it's the fact that it was on cable all the time in the 90s, giving people ample opportunity to discover a King adaptation that is scary, dramatic, and just plain fun. You can chalk up its success to three people, essentially King, Romero, and Hutton, whose dual performances as Thad Beaumont and George Stark are things of eccentric beauty. As Beaumont, Hutton projects an air of genteel civility, even as an undercurrent of bitterness and menace clearly lurks just beneath the common man's surface. Watch how he responds to the writer whose questions get under his skin, or to the scuzzball who blackmails him.
And I'll make you suffer before you die.
And Stark, Hutton goes for it with a scenery-chomping performance oozing quite literally with sinister sleaze. During his audio commentary for the film, Romero talks at length about how difficult Hutton was to work with whenever he'd go into George Stark mode, because Hutton would, for in all intents and purposes, become Stark on set. I cannot imagine attempting to direct George Stark, so kudos to Romero for surviving the ordeal. Though he still sounded exasperated by the experience, Romero does admit that at the end of the day, Hutton's performance is completely effective. And Romero's work here is among his finest. Never the subtlest filmmaker during his best moments, Dawn of the Dead and Creepshow are personal favorites. Here we see the director scaling back a bit to deliver a film that totally embodies what we expect from Stephen King's Castle Rock books. There's an atmosphere of serene Americana everywhere you look, while underneath the calm and cozy veneer, evil is working overtime. Romero does a fine job establishing the normalcy of Beaumont's sweet and boring little world, then does a bang-up job disrupting it. When Stark turns up, the film's mood shifts and becomes more ominous. There's a bit of dark humor at play too, as Stark turns out to be a bit of a jokester, fond of following up his hideous deeds with intentionally groan-inducing one-liners. Yes, George Stark is a strong purveyor of dad humor.
Well, I guess I better punt.
Although the punchlines usually come after someone's been killed, sorry, it's a cutthroat business, as if proving the point King was trying to make about the duality of people. Romero allows us to have fun while watching the grimmer stuff, appealing to our darker natures. Truth be told, George Stark is a lot more fun than Thad Beaumont, a villain we hate to love. One victim gets castrated, a couple others get their throats slit, one poor bastard gets beaten to death with his own leg. Some nasty stuff is afoot while old George is in town. He's one of Stephen King's nastier villains. It's hard to pin down exactly why the dark half doesn't get as much love as some of the more heralded King adaptations. Perhaps it's because the characters of Beaumont and Stark really aren't very likable. I won't deny that the average viewer might have a hard time getting involved in the power struggle between these two nutcases, but the film is an entertaining, well-paced, well-crafted horror drama boasting two solid performances from the same actor and a haunting ambience we associate with King's work. A special shout-out must be made to composer Christopher Young, whose score for the film is really haunting and beautiful. It's one I listen to quite often. Romero was always extremely good at casting, matching interesting actors with the characters they thoroughly inhabit. Aside from Hutton, Romero gets solid work from Amy Madigan as Thad's kind but apprehensive wife, and the legend himself, Michael Rooker, as the Castle Rock's benevolent sheriff, Alan Pangborn. Interestingly, Rooker auditioned to play Thad, but the studio wasn't going for it as he was mostly an unknown commodity at the time. We associate Rooker with some of his more over-the-top roles and villainous roles, but here he exudes a laid-back and likable aura, playing a cop who has trouble, understandably, believing that a man who never existed is committing violent murders. As a quick aside, 1993 had two Alan Pangborns on the big screen, as Ed Harris played the character in Needful Things. Let us know who your favorite Pangborn is in the comments. The film is also populated by recognizable acting vets with interesting faces like Robert Joy as grimy blackmailer Fred Clausen, and the great Julie Harris from The Haunting as Thad's colleague Reggie, Roy O'Donnell in his final role as the sullen local gravedigger, and Glenn Colrider as colorful photographer Homer Gamache, who likes taking pictures of teddy bears in coffins. As is customary in the world of Stephen King, every character is given something notable or quirky to distinguish them, which is why Romero and his great instincts pairs so well with the writer's work. And what about all those birds? The movie has more feathered friends than any since Hitchcock terrorized the town of Bodega Bay. And while sparrows aren't necessarily the most intimidating bird species one can think of, they provide a compelling visual motif that intrigues us. Turns out these birdies are actually what's known as psychopomps, which are essentially spirit guides to the afterlife. The sparrows are hovering on the edges of the story to see who wins, Thad or George, and the loser is going to get a bird-assisted one-way ticket to the spirit world. Or, wherever supernatural sparrows bring dead souls. Anyway, it was exciting to see The Dark Half get a sterling Blu-ray release from Screen Factory a few years ago, and on it you can find the informative audio commentary with Romero and a documentary that goes into the making of the film extensively. The commentary is a must. Romero goes into brutal detail about how difficult it was to work with Hutton, all those pesky birds, studio heads, and everything in between. The Dark Half was not an easy film to make, but it's a fun one to watch. Romero is so refreshingly honest about the movie and his career in general that you're almost taken aback, but George was always going to give it to you straight. You can't help but be forever grateful for this gem of a man. You've all seen The Shining and Misery a million times already. You know Night of the Living Dead and Creepshow by heart. The Dark Half seems to be one of the movies of King's and Romero's that people have either dismissed or forgotten about. It's time to change the narrative and ensure it's rightfully regarded as a minor treasure in the catalogs of those two titans of terror. Thank you for watching our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our JoBlo Videos channel. Tell your friends who like this sort of content. Turn on the bell to receive notifications for all our latest videos. We are an independent company and we appreciate your support. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, please leave them in the comments below.